All right, hello everyone, and welcome to SDI's first webinar of 2024, Sizing Up Markets, Secondary Market Research Techniques. We're so happy you could all join us today. I'm Keely Truhl, Senior Marketing Manager for Science and Medicine Group, and before we get started, I wanted to just cover a few basic housekeeping items. First, if you experience any issues throughout the broadcast, please feel free to put that in your chat, and I will do my best to help you fix those. Second, this presentation will be available on demand after the webinar has concluded. You'll receive an email with information on how to access that. And then finally, we will be taking time to answer questions at the end of the presentation, but please feel free to submit your questions at any time to the questions portion of your control panel. We'll get to as many of those as possible. Leading today's discussion is Mike Tice. Mike is the SVP of Syndicated Research for Analytical and Life Science Instrumentation here at SDI. Mike, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great, thanks Keely for the introduction. Right, so today we're going to take a brief look at secondary market research and in particular how it can be used to make estimates of the size of a market. All right, I see we have the agenda up there. So first, some introductions about me and the company, some quick definitional notes, some ideas about the different ways you can carry out secondary research and the different sources of information. Why did I choose to talk about market size? Why is that an important metric? And then we can get into more of the nitty-gritty of carrying out the research. The importance of clearly defining the market of interest. If you're asking the wrong question, you're going to get the wrong answer. Then sort of the general method for market sizing, which sounds absurdly easy. Then some tips on how to go about putting that method into action. Some notes on the limitations and caveats of secondary research. And then, as Keely mentioned, there should be some time for Q&A. So next slide, please. Science and Medicine Group is, among other things, a full-service market research and advisory firm with deep knowledge of the tools and techniques used in scientific research and medicine. Depicted here are our Insights brands. So SDI and IBO focus on laboratory instrumentation and related products. That's my part of the business. Colorama on diagnostics, IMV for medical imaging. Bioinformatics broadly addresses the life science markets and plays a key role in our primary market research efforts, making use of our Science Advisory Board, our community of scientific and medical experts who've opted in to aid us in our research. Beyond what you see here, SMG also has an artificial intelligence-fueled lead generation tool for life science marketing called Amplion. And we also have a media business built on digital communities that serve radiologists, dentists, clinical labs, and more. Next slide. So as I mentioned just now, SDI carries out market research on the market for laboratory instrumentation. So by laboratory, we mean everything from academic research to pharmaceutical drug discovery, food safety testing, quality control testing of steel production, so really broad applications. And by instrument or instrumentation, we mean something that makes a measurement in the lab. A DNA sequencer, a spectrometer, a pH meter. Because of the wealth of technology used in the labs, we've also branched out into closely related areas like sample preparation, laboratory furniture and equipment, consumables, etc. So not just things that make measurements, but things that are used alongside those instruments. In addition to our published market reports, such as our flagship 1,000-page global assessment report covering this space, we also publish IBO, our twice-monthly newsletter on these laboratory markets. And we also support confidential custom market research and consulting projects. As for me, I manage the SDI and IBO team and now have more than 20 years of experience conducting and managing research projects like these. Next slide, please. So this may be starting at too elementary a level, but I just wanted to point out the distinction between primary and secondary market research. So primary research is where you, the researcher, interact directly with your sources of information. And by source, we mean people. So conducting a poll, conducting a survey, organizing a roundtable discussion, schmoozing your colleagues. Secondary research involves just about any other kind of research you might think of involving other types of sources. Articles, government data, financial reports. These sources are typically put together by someone else, which is what makes it secondary when you are researching by looking at those sources. It's important to understand that primary is not necessarily better than secondary research. It really does depend on the kind of questions and answers you're interested in. And often doing both kinds of research can really be complementary and give you a fuller picture of any business situation. Next slide. But today, we're looking just at secondary market research. So there's several strategies you might use in carrying out a research project. So you can do it yourself. You assemble all the available sources from newspapers, journals, websites, financial data, government data, white papers, press releases, etc., and synthesize that into a picture of the market. So the advantages of that is that it's cheap if you do it yourself. The disadvantages, well, it's a lot of work. It takes time. There's the opportunity cost. What else could you or should you be doing with your time? Strategy number 2, buy it. If you're lucky, someone you trust, like SMG, has already done that legwork and has produced a report you can buy. There's a cost associated with that, but you can have the answers in your hands almost immediately. Strategy number 3, pay someone else to do the research. If there's no off-the-shelf report that meets your needs, you can go to a trusted, full-service market research firm like SMG and hire us to do the work. This probably costs a bit more than just a report would, and it will take time. But one clear advantage is that you'll be able to ensure that the scope of the project exactly meets your needs. Strategy number 4, cheat. Do some primary research. Okay, it's not actually cheating, but it's outside the scope of my talk here. All right, let's go on to the next slide, please. Okay, market size. So in this webinar, I've chosen to focus on determining market size. Why is that? Well, it's definitely a fundamental piece of information about any market. It tells you how big is the opportunity. When we're talking about market size, we're usually considering total global demand in revenue. How many millions of dollars of product X were sold last year? If you make product X, total market size gives you a measure of the total opportunity. And if you know your own revenues, that tells you your market share of the total market. And then if you follow market size over time, you can determine if you're gaining or losing share. If you don't make product X, but you're considering an acquisition or an investment, again, the market size gives you the scale of the opportunity. And once you have market size as your starting point, then you can ask other questions. If the global demand is $400 million, how much of that is in Europe versus North America? How much of that demand comes from pharma labs or environmental testing labs? So you can perform segment analysis, or you can try to work out forecasting. If you have market size data over several years, you can determine the long-term growth patterns, and the research can help to determine whether the market is accelerating or slowing down. Next slide. So defining the scope of the market. So as I mentioned before, SDI publishes market data on the laboratory instrumentation industry, but this general method of secondary market research can really be applied to anything. So here I'm sort of presenting an analogy with cars, just to point out the importance of determining the proper scope and definition of what the market is. If you can't clearly define the market, you can't find out how big it is. And the main point here is to make sure that you recognize that there may be many different pieces to a market. What to include or exclude is up to you. There's no right or wrong answer, but some choices will probably match your needs better. And if you're buying a report, you want to make sure that your definition is being reflected in the scope that the report is using. So when we talk about lab instruments, we often talk about the purchase of an initial system, whether it's a chromatograph or an electron microscope. Here in the analogy, that's like a car. You could ask, what's the market size for cars? Even at this stage, there's questions of definitions. Are you including motorcycles? Are you including light trucks? Are you only interested in the electric vehicle market? Is the used car market in scope? Are you only looking at the market for new cars? And the same is true for instruments. You say you want the chromatography market. Is that for liquid chromatography or gas chromatography or both? Are we talking only laboratory scale chromatography, or are we including industrial scale process chromatography? So just getting the basic product down and the definitions, you want to make sure that the market size matches what your actual interest is. The next column is another consideration, aftermarket components. Obviously, your initial car system comes with 4 wheels and 4 tires and a radio, but maybe you want fancy rims or a better stereo. So if you're looking not just at the car market, but more broadly at the automotive market, maybe you would want to include aftermarket components. For instruments, maybe we're talking about light sources or detectors or an additional heating or cooling element or a better heating or cooling element. All right, the next column of possible products. Consumables. Obviously, cars consume gasoline. And you might say, if I'm looking at the size of the automotive market, I'm not going to include gasoline. But maybe your use case is that you're a government economist and you're trying to figure out the average family's total spending on transportation. Then fuel would be a factor of that. Or maybe you are a gasoline company and you only care about the market size for fuel. This happens a lot in our business with companies that make life science consumables and kits, but don't actually make instruments. They're only focused on the consumables part of the market. And service. Again, if you're looking for a family's total expenses for transportation, you might include oil changes and other services and repair. Likewise, there's revenue associated with service in the instrument industry. And finally, we have what I'm calling auxiliary equipment, like maybe a car seat. Here, maybe the analogy with cars isn't quite as helpful, but for instruments, I'm thinking of things like sample prep items, automation, lab furniture like a fume hood. It's not really part of the instrument, but you may need them to properly use the instrument. So like I said, there's no right or wrong answer for what to include and what to exclude from your definition of the market. For SDI publications, we generally include the first 4 columns, and our market size estimates will have separate line item estimates for each of those 4 items. That way, if your definition differs from ours, you can add or subtract to make a better match. And then for the auxiliary equipment, we usually treat those as separate markets of their own. So if you have some lab automation like a liquid handling system, it has its own initial system and its own components and consumable tips and service associated with it. So we would see that as a separate market typically in our reports. Okay, we've spent a lot of time on this slide, but thinking about this really helps to create a more successful project for you. All right, let's go on to the next one. All right. A general method for market sizing. So this isn't maybe the only way, but this is a way to do it using secondary market research. So this slide sets out the method, and like I said, it's kind of childishly simple. We draw it up like this. So first, you identify all the suppliers, the products and services that you've included in your market definition. And in some ways, this is why the last slide was so important. If you were only thinking about Toyota and Ford, but the actual definition that would be useful for you was wider than that. You might be overlooking Goodyear tires or ExxonMobil or Valvoline or some of the other suppliers in the broader automotive space. Step 2, then you do as much focused secondary research on each of those suppliers with the general goal of attempting to determine how big their contribution to the market is. So third, based on all the evidence you can gather, you come up with your final best estimate for each supplier's market revenues that are relevant, that fit your definition of the market. And finally, you add up the estimates and voila, there's the total market size. As an added bonus, since the market size is built up from all the separate contributions from the competitors, this method automatically produces an estimate of vendor share. Okay, I realize here the middle steps may remain somewhat mysterious. How do you determine a company's relevant revenues? I might as well have penciled in that a miracle occurs. Okay, I'll try to help out on the next slide with some tips. So probably some of the major competitors you identified are going to be public companies. Public companies are required to release financial information about their revenues for their different reporting business units. That and any other information they release publicly about their businesses is a really valuable source of information that bears directly on company revenues. Of course, one limitation is that most public companies, especially in our space, they make more than one kind of product, and the level of detail of the business unit is often still a mixture of many different product lines. So it can be difficult to estimate one product line out of many, particularly if it's something the company seldom mentions in its conference calls or investor presentations. But those are the additional sources of information that you want to comb through to find, any tidbits of information you can about the product lines. One advantage we have at SDI is that since we cover dozens of product categories in the laboratory space, we analyze all of the companies that compete in this space, and we have a place to park every bit of a big company's revenues. So a lot of our effort is spent on analyzing the companies to properly apportion their revenues amongst the different product lines. That and whatever other research we have on a particular market helps us to triangulate and improve those estimates. And not to mention, we can rely on our deep background of information from having done this analysis for decades and slowly improve our estimates of what companies look like on the inside. Private companies aren't required to make public statements about their revenues. Some of them do, some of them don't. But especially for smaller companies, you'd be surprised how many times you'll find an article with the CEO in the local newspaper. We have 35 employees and made $5 million last year. We're growing fast, hope to hire 10 more people this year. This is gold when you find something like that. Some companies headquartered outside the US may report financial information to their governments, and in some cases, that's public information. And there are a lot of third-party services that offer information and data on private companies. My experience with them has been kind of hit or miss, but it's one more additional data point to consider when you're deriving your own estimates. If you can't find information about revenue, another method is to use proxies for revenue. Maybe they don't tell you how much they made last year, but they mention how many employees they have. If you make some assumptions about how productive the average worker is, then headcount can be turned into an estimate of revenue. And if they don't tell you their head count, you can always count parking spots at their headquarters. I'm tempted to say that we use satellite imagery in our market research, but really it's just Google Maps. Look at the aerial view. Okay, you've learned one of my deepest secrets here in secondary market research. All right, there's also a note here that if you're in a hurry, for many markets, there are a lot of suppliers. And it takes a long time. So if you don't have that time, you can triage things and just analyze the ones that you know are, for instance, your major competitors. And that may give you the general size of the market. And you can use some sort of rule like 80-20 or 70-30 to say that if the top 10 companies make up 70% of the market, then all the rest of the small fry make up another 30%. I just know that many times it can and does take forever to evaluate all of the individual companies that compete in the market. So if you're rushed for time or only need a back of the envelope calculation, this is one way to reduce the overall scale of the effort. All right, next slide, please. So talk about a few limitations here. So one obvious limitation is that, this process is going to produce an estimate rather than the truth with a capital T. But with enough research and triangulating from other research, you can increase your confidence in this overall estimate. And if you've gone the do-it-yourself route and put in all the work yourself to create your own internal model of a market, you can also still consider purchasing market reports from third parties to see if there's a consensus among them, whether it matches your own internal view, just as another check. Another sort of limitation is from this top-down approach of evaluating from the supplier side. It also has a limitation that there's generally a limit to the granularity you get from this high-level view. So we've built up the global market size, right? So I mentioned before that getting market size can be the first step in doing some segmentations. This is true, but there's just kind of a limit to it. I like to think of this analogy of a cake. When you calculate the market size, you have the whole cake. Then additional research lets you cut that cake by geography into neat slices, or by end market into neat slices. But if you want to cut it by geography and end market, the amount of work goes up enormously and the error bars get larger. I mean, sure, you can cut the cake into 10 vertical slices for region, 10 horizontal slices for end market, but then you get rectangular pieces that basically assume that the distribution of end markets doesn't depend on which region you're looking at, but of course it does. So it doesn't take 20 cuts to do that job properly. It takes 100 cuts to get each piece the right size. And if you add a third dimension, now it's 1,000 cuts. And realistically, we just can't find enough information to make 1,000 decisions accurately. So the cake winds up looking like the one on the right if you're trying to cut the market into into too many pieces. There are some ways to get around this. If you really need to know about the market coming from left-handed Belgian pharmaceutical scientists, it may make sense to add a primary research component to the overall project. As long as there are enough people of that sort to obtain a sufficient sample to survey, then the information from them can be compared to the overall sample, and then the secondary market sizing can set the overall scale. We know how big the cake is, and the primary research component can help you to cut it up more accurately by getting finer detail on any individual subsegment of interest. All right, great. Next slide, please. So here we have just some basic contact information for me and the websites in Science and Medicine group most related to my part of the business. And I think we do have some time left for Q&A.
Yep, great. Thank you so much for that presentation, Mike. So at this time, we're going to jump into the Q&A. If you haven't already, please go ahead and put any questions that you have in the questions portion of your control panel. If for whatever reason we don't get to your question, we'll follow up with you after the webinar has ended. I did also want to let everyone know that a PDF of the slides from today's webinar can be found in the handout section of your control panel as well. So if you're looking for those, you'll be able to download those at your leisure. Great, so seeing some stuff coming in. So Mike, we'll start here. How would you address market sizing from a primary market research standpoint?
Okay, so we're going to try and get 2 webinars in one, to do it by secondary research and primary research. I mean, you can, for sure. I guess if I step back a bit, it will involve a little bit of secondary research as well. So primary research, we're talking about, say, a quantitative survey. I mean, obviously you can ask a pharmaceutical scientist how many millions of dollars of HPLCs were sold last year, and they might or might not have an answer for you, but they're not authorities on the subject. You can't just ask them what the market size is, but you can ask them what they spend on chromatography. So you can get individual spend, individual revenue coming from bottom up, we would say. But to get the total market size, you'd have to ask everyone how much they spent on chromatography and then add everything up. So that's not really practical. So however big your sample is, you can at least get how much your entire sample spends. And there's a couple different ways to then approach it and say, but we talk to 100 pharmaceutical scientists. If from secondary research you know that there are 450,000 pharmaceutical scientists of this particular type in the world, then you can scale up your answer from the survey to match the entire universe of the market you're interested in. So that's one way to sort of extrapolate from getting an average spend to the total spend. You have to know how many people of that kind there are. So yeah, I think that's a good starting answer that gets at that question.
Great, thank you. Maybe that's a good topic for a future webinar. We'll keep that in mind. So another question, this one's a little longer. So you mentioned we talked through a lot of evaluation tips for companies, but what about the scenario where you don't even know who the companies in the market are? How would you approach finding out who is in the market in the first place? Where would you start?
All right. I mean, even when you go through that process, there are always going to be some unknown unknowns. There will be, you know, some small Chinese company that doesn't have a website in English that, you know, you never find it or something like that. But, you know, really, when we're doing secondary research, we're doing desk research. So Google is your friend. If you're looking at, you know, chromatography, you put that in your search term. Obviously, the big firms will come up first, and then smaller firms you have to dig deeper to locate. Another useful thing is if you look at trade shows, what's a relevant trade show for the kinds of products you're interested in? Who exhibits at those trade shows? And then, you know, you'll be able to look through that list and see whether they sell this product or that product. So obviously there's a lot of legwork and desk research that goes into identifying the companies in the first place. And you don't want to forget other regions. And so whatever you can do to look at, you know, some of the big, you know, organizations like JIMA in Japan, or there's a similar one in China or Europe, you want to make sure you're covering all the regions as best you can to identify all of the relevant suppliers. Another thing to consider is whether you're including distribution. You know, some people don't sell direct, they go through a distributor. There can also be some entanglement there where, you know, you have to discover who's the actual original manufacturer of the equipment that's being sold through a particular distributor. So yeah, depending, you can spend a lot of effort and looking into just identifying the companies. That's certainly, step one is not obvious or simple.
Great, thank you, Mike. I especially liked the trade show tip. It's always a good place to start. Another question we had that has come in: can you give an example of your parking lot to productivity estimate? And it says, i.e., for a small company.
Right, for a small company, I mean, so as I said, you have to come up with some sort of idea of what the productivity of an individual person is, employee. And this is going to differ based on what kind of a company it is and how profitable you might think it is and where it's located. You know, the salaries will differ whether you're looking at a Chinese company or a company based in Europe. So we have kind of some rough rules of thumb. So if you can look at the parking lot size and sort of use that as a proxy for how many employees there are, okay, now you have an estimate for how many employees there are. And then, you know, you're probably going to multiply it by a factor somewhere from 100,000 to 400,000 per person to generate, you know, what the typical revenues are. And, you know, whether you use 100,000 or 400,000 is going to depend on, you know, how much, what relevant salaries are in the region where they're headquartered, and what kind of market they're involved in. Do you think the profit margin is high or low? And, you know, things of that nature to refine the estimate. So there's a skeleton of how you would go from Google Maps to a revenue estimate.
Great. We're getting some really good questions coming in. So Another one here, Mike, let's say we're able to establish market sizing for a US market. What method could you take into account if you want to utilize US data to extrapolate, let's say, European data or Asia Pacific data? Do you have any suggestions there?
Yeah, so we have some. Again, it depends on the market. If we step back very far, when we look at some of the major competitors in our space, we see that a lot of them, if you look at their geographic breakdown, it's pretty close to a third Americas, a third Europe, a third APAC, and everything else. So if you have nothing better to go by, you can use that as your 0th order approximation for how these other regions' market size compare to the US market size. Another thing you can do, again, is if you add a primary component, you might find that the average environmental lab in the US spends this much on this particular product, but in Europe they spend twice as much. So that can give you some relative information on the spending. Again, of course, it also depends on how many labs of each type there are in each region, which would require some additional research to sort out. But that's one way that you could extrapolate in that way that would give you better than just the 0th order, but maybe the 1st order approximation to coming up with the European market size. All right.
Great. Alrighty. That goes through all of the questions that we have for today, Mike. So at this time, we'll go ahead and wrap up. If after the webinar you do have any other questions that come up, or you just want to reach out to Mike to let him know you enjoyed his presentation, you can see his email address here on the screen. I will also put that in the chat function for you guys, so it's easy to grab. I'm going to keep this webinar line open for a few minutes, so anyone who wants to download the slides from the handout section or grab that email address will have time to do so. But we thank you all so much for joining us, spending some time with us, and we hope everyone has a great rest of your day. And
Great.
thank you,
Thanks
Mike.
for your help, Healy. Yeah. Thanks everyone for coming.